part 5 of our study on the Shroud and the evidence from the Shroud of Turin. So last time we started addressing some of the Shroud's various what we call minimal relevant features, how this fulfills Criterion A of my main argument for identifying a G-belief authenticating event. So if you remember, we had those 3 criterion. First of all, the event actually took place or exists. Second, that event is extraordinary. And then the third element, that it takes place within a context charged with religious significance. So we're looking at the first criterion. What are the features of the Shroud, the Shroud's images, and so last time we covered the first 5 of those MRFs, or minimal relevant features. This time we're going to be finishing off the final 2 minimal relevant features and all of their associated aspects. As well, there's quite a bit of counter features that need to be addressed this time, is that Shroud skeptics will bring up. So just bear in mind, this podcast may be a little bit longer than normal. I usually try to put it somewhere in about the hour range there or thereabouts, but this might go a little bit over, so we'll see how that goes. In the first place, just before we get into that, I do have a couple of announcements for you guys. So just to give you a bit of a heads up, David has asked me to do some listener feedback episodes that you guys might appreciate me doing that. I wasn't really planning on doing that, but after thinking about it, I think it could be a good idea to work in some of the feedback that I've been getting at certain strategic locations in our study. So we're going to be doing that next time in part 6. I'm going to spend some time going over some of the feedback, giving a response to some of the stuff I've been hearing from you guys. And just so we're not totally bypassing advancing or progressing in the Shroud study, I'm also going to devote some time during the episode just to giving sort of an introduction to Criterion B, my methodology and how we're going to be evaluating the various image-forming hypotheses as well. So that's the plan for part 6. A second announcement to make: I have some very exciting news for you guys. So I mentioned part 4 that I would speak with my friend Shroud expert Barry Schwartz, and he's actually agreed to come on and do an interview as a guest star in a future podcast for us. So, I'm really excited about that. He's been very influential and helpful in my research on the Shroud. So, he's willing to come on. It's the 40th anniversary of STURP, which took place in 1978 this year. Once his lecture tour ends in October, he's going to come on the show probably sometime November, December, and we'll have an exciting show or interview with the actual one of the Shroud experts that I've been talking about. So I think that's it for the announcements. So let's get straight into it then, back to our study. The first of the 2 final minimal relevant features, this is something I alluded to before, but it relates to the various anatomical or medical aspects about the Shroud Man and the bloodstain images. So that's our 6th MRF, and it's things related to the condition of the Shroud Man's body or aspects about the bloodstain images there. So we'll get into it now. We're going to break it up into 2 major categories. So the first are anatomical accuracies, and then the second category is going to be related specifically to the bloodstain and or body fluid, images on the Shroud of Turin. Just so you know, there are several aspects related to this. I tried to fit in as much as I can. There's just so much research that's gone into this feature specifically. Plus, there are multiple counter features that Shroud skeptics bring up as well. So I'm going to try to cover as much as I can and break them up into categories for you guys to analyze. So the first is related to those anatomical accuracies, as I call them. And, these are things like the various wounds or injuries or otherwise physiological aspects about the Shroud Man. And study of these sorts of aspects really date back to the years just following Secondo Pia's discovery of the photographic negativity back in 1898. Various medical experts, some of the world's leading scientists and medical experts at that time, were using Pia's negative photographs and began to study the Shroud Man from an anatomical or medical perspective. And this really dates back to the year 1900 to 1902 with Paul Vignon, who was a professor of biology in Paris, And Yves Delage, again, he was a professor of comparative anatomy who was an agnostic, by the way. He was not a believing Christian. He was not biased. He was against the Christian side. However, these two, along with 3 other scientists, studied the shroud images and proved that the shroud images are actually authentic, represent a real human body. They're not artistic fakes, and they presented their findings in that regard in a full-scale report to the entire world's scientific community at the French Academy of Sciences in the early 1900s there. Just to give you an idea, since they started it, there's been a whole host of medical anatomists or forensic experts. I mentioned Robert Buckland, for example. They've subsequently studied the Shroud Man and made further discoveries, and all of them, everyone that's actually studied the shroud, the actual cloth, for example, with the stirp, they all conclude this is a real human being with real human blood based on the injuries. And I'm just to give you an idea of some of the caliber of people and the amount of medical experts that have studied this aspect. I'm looking right now at a list of about 24 such experts in total, just dating from the 20th century to the present alone. And every single one of these people, there are no exceptions, have all provided statements that in their medical expertise as authorities in their field, they all agree that the Shroud Man's images and wounds accurately reflect an adult human male who was well-proportioned and of average height and weight, who has appeared to have suffered from various wounds and also died due to crucifixion. All of these experts, conclusively as a sort of a summarization of their findings, they all seem to be saying that the Shroud Man's injuries is anatomically flawless. Perfection. And I'll give you an idea of some of the caliber of some of the people I'm talking about here. So I mentioned Paul Vignon and Yves Delage. There is also forensic pathologist Robert Buckland, provided his source in the previous podcast, and I have some more sources from him today. There's Dr. John Heller. He was a stirp scientist and professor of internal medicine and medical physics at Yale University. Dr. Bema Bologna. And no, he's despite his name, he's not full of baloney, but I know my sense of humor is not the best. But anyways, so he was the chair of forensic medicine at the University of Turin. We have Dr. Francesco Lacava, a pathologist in Naples, Italy. Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, the chief of epidemiology for the U.S. Army's headquarters. He was also a clinical instructor for Tufts Medical School. And finally, another one, Dr. Frederick T. Zugby, who is the chief medical examiner of Rockland County in New York. These are just some of the names on this giant list of forensic and medical experts who all attest that the Shroud Man represents an anatomically accurate human being and was not an artistic fake. So just to give you a quick reminder, though, as part of our MRF approach, despite the wording and despite what I've just said about these experts, I think it is a fact that it's real blood, and I think it is a fact that it had to involve a real human corpse. Whatever formed these images, a real human body with real human blood was involved. But I'm bending over backwards for the skeptic here. I'm not even going to assume this, because obviously if I do that, then most, if not all, artistic theories are just garbage right away. Well, it's not a painting then if it really has a real body. So I'm not going to assume that this is the case. I'm going to bend over backwards, not assume that there was a real body or that it is real blood as part of our MRF approach. And as such, all of the aspects that I'm going to list, despite the wording of it, just remember, we're not assuming that it is a real human body. Let's pretend, let's not assume maybe there could be some artistic way of depicting this or something until we get to the image forming mechanism analysis in Criterion B. Okay, so what's the first anatomical accuracy here? And for Darren, if you're listening, this is really, I mentioned, you asked a question about, well, couldn't some artist know about the way to do historically accurate wounds on a person? And part of my response was, I'm going to cheat and use some data from, not only was it historically improbable for an artist to know how to depict these wounds, it was also medically impossible for him to know. And here's one of the things that I had in mind. So there are various scourge and scratch marks that have been discovered on the shroud. These were discovered with the 1898 photonegative images taken by Secondo Pia, and we've discovered about 100 to 130 dumbbell-shaped scourge wounds on the Shroud Man. You can see this for yourself when you Google search that black and white image. But much of these, or if not all of them, were previously invisible to the naked eye. No one could see these, but they suddenly appeared in all their glory only with the modern camera technology. Why an artist would create some invisible wounds, goodness knows. But anyways, these scourge marks vary in intensity from light contusions to deep penetrating puncture wounds, and there are 2 lobes present on each of the mark. So it indicates that there was some kind of bifid instrument that was used. And, based on the form and distribution of the marks, virtually all medical experts who have studied the Shroud images in detail conclude that these wounds were inflicted by some sort of whip-like device. Jesus, he was whipped, he was scourged. That fits. That makes sense with what we have with the Gospels. And interestingly, the size and shape of the wounds on the Shroud Man match precisely with those that would have been caused by the use of an ancient Roman flagrum. Not readily available equipment in the medieval ages. Would have been hard for some medieval artist to know how to accurately paint or depict or something. But yeah, that was the Roman whip-like device used to scourge criminals in the time of Jesus, and it was not really prevalent in later centuries of after the fall of the Roman Empire. One other thing, in addition to many of the scourge marks, Stirps actually illuminated these scourge marks using ultraviolet fluorescence lighting, and they actually showed extremely fine scratches that, like I said, were not visible with the naked eye. So, sometimes there's about 3 or 4 of these parallel, very fine scratches that can be distinguished in the areas of these dumbbell-shaped wounds. So, and just so you know, these scratches are also present in other areas outside of the scourge wounds as well. Basically, various chemical and spectral tests have also confirmed the presence of halos, or what appear to be blood serum retraction rings. Again, invisible to the naked eye. This alleged artist created invisible serum retraction rings, accurate to what real blood does. Basically when you bleed, your blood clots, and then it later retracts from the outer edges of the wound, and it squeezes out serum, which become these little clear liquid serum retraction rings. This is a process known as syneresis. And once again, so we're not going to assume this is actual serum retraction rings, even though it is. Yeah, we'll call them halos, or if I say blood serum retraction rings, just pretend that's in quotes for our MRF purposes. But as to why an artist would paint invisible, clear halos around the blood, these scourge wounds and scratches that appears to simulate what a serum retraction ring was, when it would have been medically impossible for him to even know about such things, I think you're completely ridiculous as a Shroud skeptic at that point. Also, so just to give you an idea, variously combined with all the scourge wounds and all the minor cuts and scratches that Stirp scientists have discovered using UV fluorescence testing, the most accurate count of the wounds associated with the scourging is about 372 individual wounds. So there's 159 on the front and 213 on the back of the Shroud Man. Yeah, you just have to ask yourself, is the Shroud skeptic really suggesting that some medieval artists purposely created invisible images that were medically and historically accurate, and yet were completely invisible? There's no reason for him to create such wounds, because no one would be able to appreciate it. And as far as he would know, he wouldn't know about photographic negative camera technology. I mean, that didn't come around until the 19th century. So I think this notion, this anatomical aspect alone says the artist theory is impossible. This is really strong evidence. Okay, so next up we have the facial and head wounds. And so with this, in the first place, the cheeks appear to be swollen, and the right cheek contains a triangular-shaped wound of some kind. Likewise, the nose is also swollen and bruised, and it indicates evidence that the cartilage might be separated from the bone. Some medical experts mention that. There's also several authentic-looking blood marks on the head, which run in differing directions, from their points of origin. So that suggests that the head was in differing positions as the blood flowed down from the head. Also unique to Jesus, circling the top, front, and middle of the back of the head is a series of scalp wounds, which give the impression that they were caused by the Shroud Man wearing some kind of cap of multiple sharp pointed objects that, pierced his scalp and caused these wounds. Oh, I seem to remember Jesus in the Gospels having a crown of thorns, something to that effect. That's not a common form of punishment that ancient Romans did. It certainly sounds like Jesus to me, or at the very least, some person is trying to make this Shroud Man look like Jesus. Basically, just to give you a bit of a quote here, the blood in the hair seems to register with the blood being transferred to the cloth also from the sides of the face. So there are blood stains that correspond to the sides of the face, and that's going to be relevant when we come to image forming mechanisms, because this indicates that the shroud, at least at some point, was wrapped around the face and or body before the occurrences of the blood imaging phenomenon. So that's an important aspect to remember there as well, that there are bloodstains that correspond to the sides of the face. Before we move on to the next aspect, we have to point out and be fair to the shroud skeptic that there are two potential counter features related to the facial and head wounds that we have. So the first one is that this one's kind of iffy, but it's basically, they're saying that the Shroud Man appears to have soft hair. Well, wait a second. I thought you were saying this guy, this Jesus, had been crucified and scourged. His hair would be soaked with blood and matted down. It wouldn't appear soft and fluffy or something like that, like we would expect if there was a lot of blood or sweat and it was soaked. However, this observation is really subjective. It can't be established on a balance of probabilities. You can look at it and make a subjective judgment. Well, it looks soft to me or something, but it is ambiguous. Shroud experts can't really agree. This is a controversial fact, so I don't think you can prove that the Shroud Man actually has soft hair on a balance of probabilities. Therefore, I don't think it's something I need to account for. However, let's pretend it's true. Is this a problem for pro-shroud proponents that are, proposing radiation or some kind of extraordinary mechanism? Well, no. Again, if we're proposing supernatural mechanisms, then anything's possible. I mean, remember, we were saying, well, what about the Shroud Man having white hair? Maybe at the time of the resurrection, the Shroud Man's hair was transformed white. Well, by the same token, it could have been transformed soft and dry as opposed to wet. So with this counter feature isn't a problem either way, but it can't be proven on a balance of probabilities. It is subjective judgment and can't be scientifically verified, and as such, it's not going to be considered. It's not going to be held against any theories. Now, the next one, this one is true. So the shroud skeptic says that there are various head wounds that are portrayed inaccurately over top of the hair. Well, that's not the way blood actually flows, man. It would soak through the hair as we would expect. It wouldn't be in like little rivulets on top of the hair. So here's what the shroud experts, the STURP scientists, describe it this way. There are blood traces not consistent with scalp hair traces soaked with blood in correspondence to the image of the hair on the front side of the Shroud Man's image. So here's where the shroud skeptics say, gotcha. This obviously represents an artistic fake who, some ignorant medieval artist didn't have a dang clue what he was doing, and he portrayed these wounds inaccurately. And I have to admit, this is an undeniable fact. It does count as an MRF and needs to be considered. However, contra to the skeptics, I actually think this feature hurts the skeptic's case. It doesn't help you. It helps me as a pro-shroud person. This proves that a supernatural image mechanism must have been at play. Or there are ways, for example, Mark Antonici with Arthur Lind have come up with their historically consistent hypothesis. And he says not only did the body disappear, but the bloodstains disappeared, including from, various areas that wouldn't be covered by the shroud at the time the body images were formed, and then these bloodstains reappeared onto the shroud. So again, this is a miraculous explanation that could explain this data. Let's flip it around. Does it make sense that some medieval artist, so he was brilliant, he portrayed light years, quantum leaps ahead of his medical experts at the time in the medieval period, paintings invisible scratches, very fine, serum retraction rings, completely accurate blood flows. So accurate, it tricks 24 of the world's leading medical experts into thinking this is involving a real body. But somehow the obvious thing about painting bloodstains over top of the hair, which any Tom, Dick, or Harry would have known was obviously fake. I mean, they would have seen people getting killed with blows to the head all the time. They would know that blood soaks through. It doesn't come through in rivulets on top of the hair. But somehow he gets that wrong. So I don't think the Shroud skeptic can have it both ways here. Either the artist was some kind of medical genius depicting anatomical features that were impossible for him to know about, or he was totally incompetent, portraying inaccurate wounds on top of the head and messing up things like that. So, I don't think you can have it both ways. It's got to be one or the other. Or, just a thought, maybe there was no artist to begin with, and there's some other supernatural explanation as to why we have the evidence that we have. So moving on to hand and arm wound. The left hand is placed over top of the right one, over top of the groin for modesty purposes. And on the left hand, we have a wound that appears to be coming out of the lower region or the wrist area. So we know there was a piercing there, and then there's a blood flow flowing down the arms from this wound, and these are comparable to transfers that would be expected if the arms were posed in non-horizontal positions or angles. And this suggests just like Jesus was crucified, seems to match up. This seems to be a crucifixion. There's a nail there piercing that area. Here's what some medical experts have described. This comes from Gil Lavoie. So the shroud shows that gravity affected the blood flow associated with the wound to the left wrist. The alignment of the blood flow relative to the direction of gravity has been used forensically to show that the arms were raised at an angle of approximately 20 degrees from the horizontal, while the man was suspended on the cross in the death position, and that the shoulders were likely dislocated. The reason this is important is because medieval artists always used to depict Jesus' crucifixion with him having nails through the center of the palms, and it wasn't until the 1930s that modern medical experiments with, Pierre Barbet, for example, proved that this is anatomically impossible for a person to hold up his own body weight, because the nail, based on just the weight of the person, the nail would tear through the flesh of the palm of the hands, and he wouldn't be able to, support himself on the cross. So some shroud medical experts say that, they've done some experiments. I'll talk about that in the next part. But just to be fair to the shroud skeptic here, there is some degree of speculation involved with this feature or aspect, because actually we can't prove conclusively that the nail went through the wrist. Some medical experts, pro-shroud proponents, have a bit of a dispute here, because all we see is the back of the hand. We don't see where the nail, like the inner part, right? The forearm. We see the back of the hand, and from that it looks like... So it could be that the nail went in through the lower part of the palm or the wrist, but it's definitely can rule out that it's not the center of the palm, which is what most medieval people thought. That they thought that's how crucifixion worked, that's what they draw in their paintings and that sort of thing. But yeah, to be fair to the shroud skeptic, we can't make the conclusive claim that we know the Shroud Man's nail went through his wrist as opposed to through some point in the palm or something, and there is some dispute on that by the experts. Now, one issue, here's the part where it gets a bit controversial. So I mentioned Dr. Pierre Barbet, and he is one of those medical experts back in the 1930s. He was an autopsy surgeon, and he really did a lot of research and experiments with cadavers over the course of really 3 decades to test scientifically, whether this problem would obtain or not, because some people say, well, if you're saying it goes through the wrist, then that's going to violate messianic prophecy, because there are so many small bones in the wrist area that it would probably break some of them. And as we know, the Messiah can't have any broken bones. So, aha, says the shroud skeptic, we've got you guys, you messed up here. But Pierre Barbet did actual scientific medical experiments using real human bodies and crucified them. The result was a resounding answer, according to him, that this is not true. Because what happens is the nail will go through and it'll divert into what's called the space of Destot, So it actually pushes aside the 4 small bones. They're flexible in that way in the wrist without breaking them, and then goes into this space. Furthermore, when he pushed the nail in even further, he actually noticed another interesting feature, that the thumb, because the nail will put pressure on and injure the median nerve in the wrists, and this will force the thumb to contract inward. This was a medical fact that was previously unknown before the 20th century, but yet somehow, incredibly, this medieval artist on the Shroud Man's images has the thumbs not being able to be seen. He's just got 4 fingers. The thumbs are retracted in, just like what Pierre Barbet medically proved would happen if someone was crucified and the nail went through the wrists and impacted on the median nerve. So this is rather incredible there. This is pretty interesting evidence, I would say. And just as a point of caveat, I'm going to include, because there is another medical expert more recent than Pierre Barbet, and he addresses this research and refutes it. His name is Dr. Frederick T. Zugby. So I'm going to include his sources on this because there is some controversy about these findings. But again, both these experts agree, no, it's a real person that was crucified. So nothing that Zugby says helps the Shroud skeptic in saying that the Shroud is some kind of artistic fake. They both say, no, it's conclusively proven that it's a real human body corpse that's involved here. There's just discrepancy on this aspect about does it go through the wrists and was Pierre Barbet's research. Christian apologists still use Barbet's research, for example, with death by crucifixion. Well, how do you die? It's through asphyxiation. Well, it was Barbet that proved that back in the 1930s. Zugby says, well, no, I think it's more related to shock, and he tries to take Barbet to task, saying, his research is based on some faulty assumptions and stuff. So, yeah, look out for that. I'm going to provide the sources to the counters there, but be aware that there are medical experts on both sides who take differing opinions on that issue. But all of them agree, no matter what, at the end of the day, it is a real body. So that part stays. So I think at this point, we have to be fair to the Shroud skeptic, because there are some various counter features that come up, basically in general. I call these the anatomical inaccuracies argument, and there are several that Shroud skeptics try to point out and we need to address. So in the words of STURP scientists who readily admit this, so they say this: although the anatomical details are generally in close agreement with standard human-to-body measurements, some of the measurements made on the Shroud Man's image, such as with the hands, calves, and torso, do not agree with anthropological standard. Also additionally, on the inner side of the frontal Shroud Man's upper left leg, which is it's sort of upraised, and it's barely encoded. It looks a lot thinner compared to the right man's thigh, the Shroud Man's right thigh, which is a lot more thicker. So, this is sort of an odd thing. Think of a medieval artist. Why would they paint the thighs like that? That doesn't make any sense. There must be some other explanation going on for that. But anyways, with regards to these anatomical inaccuracies in general, well, what happened, Dale? I thought you said these medical experts, they all agreed the Shroud Man was anatomically flawless. Now all of a sudden you're admitting that we have proof that it's not flawless. There are some inaccuracies that have been quantified and discovered on the Shroud Man. Well, I guess that means the Shroud skeptics can now, turn off their brains again and wrap themselves up in their little blankies of self-assurance that the Shroud is a medieval fake. Yes, we win. We did it. It's an anatomically ignorant artist that's responsible for these images. Well, not so fast there, Mr. Skeptic. I think there are a few things that you need to know. In the first place, skeptics seem to don't forget the amazing accurate anatomical accuracies, which are impossible for an artist to paint, and which are in close agreement with standard human-body measurements. As to how you get that mix with some kind of medieval artist, I don't believe you. I'm sorry. That just seems ridiculous to me. So there must be some other explanation as to why there are some inaccuracies as shown on the Shroud, even though a real human body is still being used. As I said, forensic calculations and experimental draping from volunteer subjects in a model of the Shroud cloth do indicate that the man had a height of approximately 5'9", or 5'10" when you don't factor in stretching of the cloth and that sort of thing, was 170 pounds. And this body is anatomically well developed and normal. But with regards to these minor accuracies, these are all readily explainable because, there are things like motion blurs that could have taken place. Or there's also tent effects, like a camping tent. And these are caused by things like the upraised left leg, causing the shroud to become sort of like a tent, or the hands covering the groin would also create various distortions on the body images encoded on the shroud. They would sort of be enhanced by the draped cloth collapsing, if a cloth collapse hypothesis were true, because once the body disappears, it creates sort of a vacuum, and the cloth sort of flattens out a little bit, creating different wrapping configurations. Also, with regards to the fingers, this is another one I didn't mention, but they seem to be unnaturally elongated. They're longer than normal. Various Mark Antonici, again, he can readily account for this feature as well. So basically, it's due to the fact that the fingers on the Shroud Man are curved. They're slightly curved inwards. And, when the body images are being encoded on the cloth, once the cloth was then straightened, it makes the fingers appear to be longer than they would on a normal human being. And this is something that's readily explainable. I mean, you can confirm it for yourself. It's easily observed by anyone using a measuring tape to measure from your wrist to the tips of your fingers, both while curved and then while held straight out. The first measurement will always be longer than the latter. So this is just readily explainable. It's not a problem at all in postulating that there was a real body involved. Again, but on the other hand, just imagine this medieval artist getting impossible details correct, but screwing up on these obvious errors by painting fingers longer than they should be, or thin left thigh versus a thicker right thigh. I'm sorry, I don't believe the Shroud skeptic that it's not plausible to me that he would mess up such obvious details that anyone would have known better about. Okay, so there are also various shoulder and knee abrasions, but this is not going to be included. This is a type C fact. So just be aware of it because it is mentioned in the literature, but it's not a confirmed fact, so it's not going to be a part of an MRF in our analysis. We also have leg and foot wounds, piercing wounds or holes in the metatarsal regions of the Shroud Man's feet. Such a wound is consistent with a nail being driven through the feet during crucifixion. As I said, additionally, the left leg of the Shroud Man appears upraised and bent, so that the left foot looks as though it was placed on top of the right one. This is a standard position for crucifixion victim being nailed to a cross. Interestingly, there's no evidence that the legs of the victim were broken. Remember that Old Testament messianic prophecy the Shroud skeptics wanted to use with regards to the wrists? Well, that comes into play here. It's interesting that the Shroud Man displays no obvious evidence that proves the legs were broken or that any of the bones were broken. And in terms of the nail through the cross, we made that discovery of Johannan that I said back in 1968. He still had the nail from his crucifixion in his ankles. Now, with this evidence, it is important to note that there are differences between the position that the Johannan, the archaeological evidence, was nailed through. His feet were sort of on a side angle, and he was done through the ankles, whereas the Shroud Man's is more through the top, more through the the metatarsal regions of the feet. So there is a difference there. But I'll be including a 106-page source about specifically on the topic about the nails through the feet and whether that makes sense for crucifixion and that sort of thing. So you'll be able to check into that. But just be aware, all the experts agree it is a plausible position for ancient Romans to crucify through the metatarsal regions of. Okay, now interestingly, the chest wound. This is the densest and largest blood flow or blood stain injury that's on the Shroud Man, and all medical and pathological experts agree that the blood depicted here resulted from what they say is a post-mortem blood flow. They can tell the difference between pre- and post-mortem blood flows. This artist is incredible. How does he know the difference, But anyways, it was caused by piercing the right side of the body between the 5th and 6th ribs and into the thoracic cavity. So the wound itself resembles the size and shape of the ancient Roman lancia. It just happens to match up. This medieval artist really got around and saw ancient weapons and how he should depict them. But this is really just sort of a spear with a leaf-shaped blade that has since been discovered by modern archaeologists. Now it's important here because the bloodstain corresponding to the right side of the Shroud Man's here, it shows a separation of blood from a clear liquid material. That's the quote from the experts. Now this is just consistent with what the Gospel of John says about when Jesus was stabbed or pierced with the lancia, the right auricle of his heart would have filled with blood, and a massive pleural effusion of pericardial fluid, that's the clear liquid, from the area of the heart would flow out along with the blood as a result of this of the traumas that he'd been through. Yeah, this is exactly what we find with the Shroud Man and what we'd expect from if it belonged to Jesus. The blood would flow out along with the watery fluid from the pleural cavity there. So, to think that some medieval forger could have known that post-mortem blood and watery fluid would have flowed out from the right side, because remember, this is the opposite. The heart is on the left side. Why is it this medieval artist is deliberately putting this wound on the right side of the Shroud Man, as seen with the naked eye, just so that when people have modern camera technology and take a photo image, it lines up precisely where it should be on the left side in the true photo positive image. This medieval artist was a genius that these shroud skeptics like to pretend they believe in and that sort of thing. This is just impossible, I'm sorry to say. There was no artist. It involves a real human body. Okay, now in terms of other anatomical aspects, so it was also discovered by Stirp that there, on the inner side of the cloth, there are no signs of decomposition or putrefaction liquids of any type, absolutely nothing. So if this Shroud Man did have a real body, it didn't decay to the point where there is a buildup of decomposition or putrefaction liquids which left any residue on the shroud. There's nothing there. Likewise, we also can tell from the body displays certain features of rigidity, like on the buttocks, for example. It's not flattened, totally flattened the way we would expect if you just lie down on a stone slab. This indicates that if it is a real body, that it was still in the rigor mortis phase. And as we know, rigor mortis, depending on environmental conditions, will last no more than about 3 to 5 days. So somehow the images were formed on the shroud, if it involves a real human body, as I think you have to admit it does, but we're not going to assume that in our MRF approach. But if I've convinced you so far that if there was a body, that body created images. It created images in the rigor mortis phase and left the shroud before any signs of decomposition or putrefaction liquids could build up or accumulate on the shroud cloth, suggesting that this process took place within about 3 to 5 days. Who does that sound like? Oh, Jesus rose on the 3rd day. Interesting. However, with the rigor mortis thing, again, this is not going to be an MRF because it is a class 2 fact. It assumes that there was a real body. So the MRF will just be that the Shroud Man appears in a rigid state. So that could apply to a statue as well, But just be aware, if it is a real body, which I think the other evidence should force you to believe, well then that means it's in rigor mortis, giving a time frame of when the shroud images had to have been formed, which just precisely align with what the Gospels say about Jesus rising on the 3rd day. Okay, so our last anatomical aspect, and again, this is a controversial one. I don't use it. I'm not sure about it. I'm skeptical of it myself, and it's not going to be an MRF, but I need to mention it because this is the main argument. It is used by pro-shroud experts like Gary Habermas, for example, in arguing the shroud. And if true, this would prove that a supernatural radiation event from the body is the only explanation. If this aspect is ever confirmed to be true, it's game over, skeptics. Take your cards and go home. We win. And this is the fact that there are various bones, teeth, and parts of the skull that have been, bones in the wrist area, for example, and other areas have been claimed to have been to exist on the shroud? Well, obviously those inner parts of the body, only if radiation emits out of the body could such features be present on the shroud cloth. Yeah, like I said, I've seen pictures. Barry Schwartz sent me close-up pictures of the facial region, and I have to confess, I think I do see what they're talking about with regards to the teeth, at least. I'm not sure about the other stuff, but with the teeth, I can kind of see what they're talking about. So they're not making stuff up, but there are various issues that make me skeptical of it. It corresponds with, I think it's the weft of the cloth or something like that. Barry Schwartz doesn't agree with this. He thinks it's all pattern recognition, and I tend to think it's at least an equal possibility that he could be right, that we're just seeing patterns. Maybe I'm tricking myself when I think I see these teeth in the Shroud Man's mouth. You know, it's kind of like looking up to a cloud and, oh, it looks like a lion or something like that. So this isn't an MRF. This is a type C fact in those list sources I provided you in part 4. But just be aware, pro-shroud proponents do use this as an evidence to argue their case. And if it's true or ever confirmed to be true, my goodness, it's game over, Mr. Skeptic. You lose right away, in my opinion. So I'll provide some sources about the bones and teeth so you guys can look it up for yourself. But I myself am skeptical and don't use this. Okay, so now it's time for some more counter features of the Shroud Skeptic. Before we move on to the category of the bloodstains. So I told you guys there's quite a lot to go over in this podcast, so I'll try to be as quick as I can. So basically, some of these counter features, I've already covered historical inaccuracy counter features in part 3 of our study, in the part 3 podcast. You know, I've covered the art history and coin arguments in part 2, so we're going to bypass that. That's already been covered. However, there are various theological or biblical counter features or objections that, believe it or not, Christians raise. It's not always the Richard Dawkins types and, you know, that are the Shroud skeptics. Actually, some of the most staunchest critics of the Shroud are Christians, believe it or not. So I'm getting this from an article I provided in the sources. These are the 5 arguments Christians use against the Shroud by Barry Schwartz. So the first one is that the Shroud is a graven image. Therefore, anyone who believes in it is committing the sin of idolatry. You know, this gets into a technical definition of what it means to worship. You know, dulia versus, I think, latria is the terminology. Like someone like James White, for example, he would be, no, you're worshiping the Shroud. But I just think this is ridiculous. In the first place, it's not a man-made object. If it's truly miraculous and was created by Jesus' resurrection. So it's not idolatry in the technical sense, but no Catholic is worshiping the Shroud images. It's just a sort of focal point or an evidence that people are using. I mean, no one worships the Red Sea, even though that was privy to a miracle by Moses, or with the Bible. You know, are we worshiping the Bible because we believe that's God's miraculously inspired word or something? No, I think that people like James White are going too far. They're being too strict with what they think worship would entail. So there's nothing about the Shroud that means we're worshiping that object just because it's miraculous. Also, here's one that I myself used to have. This is just a Catholic relic. Like I said, before I knew anything about the Shroud, this is one that I have to ashamedly confess that I thought about it when someone mentioned the Shroud. It's Catholic garbage. It's not real. That was before I learned that Gary Habermas took the evidence from the Shroud seriously. Being a conservative Baptist Christian scholar, this really amazed me, and it was what compelled me to say, okay, I'm going to look into this thing a little bit more. However, as to addressing the objection, there's nothing Catholic, there's nothing inherently Catholic about the Shroud images. Sure, it was owned by Catholics historically, but that's not enough to prove that, you know, it's just another Catholic relic. That's guilt by association. That's a logical fallacy. And there's nothing about the Shroud images that specifically attest to Catholicism versus, you know, a Protestant denomination or the Eastern Orthodox. So I think the Shroud images attest to biblical Christianity, the biblical Jesus, and therefore falls under the category of Christianity proper. You know, nothing more, nothing less. The evidence from the Shroud can be used by a Protestant, can be used by a Catholic, or an Eastern Orthodox. There's nothing inherent to one denomination or something like that based on the Shroud. In the same way, the historical evidence for the resurrection can be said to belong to can be used by Catholics, Protestants, or Eastern Orthodox. Okay, here's one we covered in the historical objections. But remember Jesus has long hair, and the skeptics, sort of ignorant of the actual archaeologists and what the ancient historians say, well, that's totally unhistorical. But there is also a biblical point here, and they say that long hair was forbidden for Jews. For example, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14, the Apostle Paul says, doesn't even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a shame unto him? Well, I guess the Shroud Man has long hair. That can't be Jesus then. But bear in mind that this verse was written 20 years later to Greeks, not to Jews, living in Corinth. And it was a completely different context. I don't think this was some kind of universal rule, but it was more a cultural specific. Paul's letters are occasional letters. They're written for certain aspects, for certain reasons. In the second place, the Bible does allow for long hair. Remember Samson? What about the Nazarites and the Nazarite vows? Just take a little look at Numbers chapter 6, verse 5, or Leviticus chapter 19, verse 27, and you'll see the Shroud skeptic is basically totally out to lunch in this case. He's just wrong, period. Okay, another one is that, well, the Old Testament Messianic prophecies say that the Messiah's beard should be plucked out entirely. But the Shroud Man, he has a full beard, right? So I guess this violates Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6, where it says, they plucked the hair off from his cheeks. However, it doesn't say they took off all of his facial hair. It just says they plucked off his hair. So yes, someone can grab your beard and some of it will come out. It doesn't even need to be a full chunk of it. But remember, maybe perhaps the V-shaped notch, maybe that indicates some of the hair was plucked out and a big chunk was taken out. Or if you believe Gary Habermas, those are just strands poking out. It could be just that some people can pull out hair from a beard, but it doesn't make any noticeable gap in the beard. So there's nothing about the fact that the Shroud Man has a beard that disproves this Old Testament verse as being fulfilled. Okay, and here's the final theological objection. This one is the best one in my opinion, but it's the fact that, well, the Gospels or the New Testament don't mention anything about Shroud Man images. It talks about the burial cloths, but there's nothing in there about miraculous images of Jesus. Christians are perplexed. Why is this the case? Why would they not mention such remarkable images? Why wouldn't they start venerating this burial shroud just like Catholics venerate the Shroud of Turin today? Well, the answer is remarkably simple, actually. So the reason there's no record of early Christians mentioning or venerating images is because there weren't any shroud images in the first place. What are you talking about here, Dale? I know it might sound like I've maybe had one too many at this point, but trust me, I know what I'm saying here. So under certain supernatural resurrection theories, let's pretend this is the case for a second. If the body images were formed by a supernatural resurrection whereby radiation, like a neutron flux or a neutron and protons radiation, were used to create the images of degraded cellulose, then it could take years, decades, or even possibly up to centuries for the images to form. Think about how a newspaper will gradually turn yellow when left in the sun. Remember sun ultraviolet radiation. That's John Jackson's theory of how the shroud images were formed, for example. It's a gradual process, and it could take time for the images to darken to the point that we can see them like we do today. And Mark Antonici, he also mentions this gradual process of the images becoming visible. So this explains why they're not mentioned, because there were no shroud images that were visible immediately after the resurrection. Okay, so let's move on to our second category, and this is the category of the bloodstains. Once again, there's a heck of a lot to present here for you guys. I've done my best to include as much as I can in the podcast. Again, I'll provide some sources, as well as I'll be attaching my own tables from my Shroud chapter where I list out all the minimal relevant features for you guys, and another table listing out all of the various anatomical aspects and all of the aspects under the bloodstains as well that I use, along with the counter features. So you'll have that for ease of reference if David can attach that to the WordPress somehow. With the bloodstains, in the first place, as I alluded to with the scourge marks before, there are multiple blood flows and body fluid stains present on the shroud. Some of these blood flows indicate differing angles or directions of the body position. So it's not that the body was in one single position when these various blood flows were being encoded on the cloth or taken in on the cloth. There are discerned differences between pre-mortem and post-mortem blood flows that can be discerned by medical experts. Here's a quote from Pierre Barbet. From some of these shroud experts, the blood flows are in the exact shape and appearance of actual blood as it forms, flows, and congeals on human skin. And these bloodstains have very clearly defined borders, and this is unlike the body image. Remember, the body images are diffuse. They're uncircumscribed. They don't have a border, and that's why they disappear within close range. The bloodstains, by contrast, have very clearly marked, definable borders or edges to them. Now, just before we start getting into more MRFs on the bloodstains, remember, I don't want to presume that the bloodstains are actually blood, even though, again, it's proven true. The shroud skeptic doesn't know what he's talking about if he thinks this is paint. But I'm going to get into that into Criterion B of discussing and debating whether it's, what the evidence is against the fact that the bloodstains are paint, because there is scientific evidence by Walter Macrone, who's a part of STIRP, suggesting that the bloodstains could be composed of paint. And that is scientific evidence that needs to be taken seriously and addressed. But we're going to leave that for another podcast. But just to give you a brief summary on the other end, what is it that causes STIRP science? What is some of the findings that cause STIRP scientists to say, no, this is actual blood? Remember, this isn't an MRF, but it's important for you to know because I think it's conclusive. There's no doubt this is blood. I could use this as an MRF if I wanted to rule out many artistic theories. But I'm going to bend over backward and say I don't even need to assume that. I can still defeat the shroud skeptic. And just before we get, with regards to the angles of the bloodstains, I mentioned that it's been proven that some of the blood flows are not consistent with a body lying in a supine or horizontal body position. There have been various measured angles for some of the bloodstains in different positions, including ones that would be expected if the arms were posed in a non-horizontal position, just like on a cross. Now, Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, one of the medical experts who studied the shroud evidence, he's gone even further in this regard because he's argued through various scientific experiments that the angles of these flows are actually consistent with a body being in a vertical position, such as one would be when they're crucified specifically. He's argued from this that we can prove the Shroud Man arms were in a crucifixion position. Now, that's going a little bit too far. That's a type C fact, but be aware that that is in the literature. But the solid MRF fact is that we know the body was in non-horizontal positions and that the arms were in, non-horizontal positions when the blood was flowing from the wounds. Right, so to get back into, what are just to list off some of the evidences that prove the shroud's bloodstains are blood. Again, this isn't a part of our MRFs, but let's just see what's out there. So, for some of you shroud skeptics that are just accustomed to saying, it's been proven to be paint, you might want to buckle up because this is going to be a bit of a bumpy ride for you guys. It's going to be sort of a rude awakening for you. So in 1980, STIRP team members, biophysicist John Heller and blood expert, the world's expert in this area, blood chemist Alan Adler, collaborated in publishing the report based on various chemical testing. They had, and we're going to get into this when I combat Walter Macrone's findings in part 2. I'm going to contrast his findings with the STIRP scientists here in more detail. But basically, they proved beyond all reasonable doubt scientifically that the blood on the shroud was actual blood. Now, the original tests back then were not able to classify the blood as human because the chemical tests back then couldn't really distinguish, the blood between different animal species. Now, that was supplemented in 1981. Again, Heller and Adler extended their research on the Shroud blood samples that they received from Stirp, and they included serological techniques. So that involves diagnostic identification of two major blood serum proteins, albumin and immunoglobulin, which is an immunoglobulin. So that's the antibody there. These were identified and proven to be present in the Shroud. And using that research, they were able to further classify the blood in the Shroud as primate blood. Now, in 1985, the Italian professor, remember Dr. Bema Bologna, who was an expert pathologist, he again used serological techniques to confirm Heller and Adler's identification of the immunoglobulin in the Shroud blood. And he evaluated the expression of additional blood components as well. So specifically, he identified the antigens identified as M, N, and S. That research showed the blood stains on the Shroud were M, N, and S positive. This is unlike M and N antigens that are shared between certain primates and humans. So the S antigen there is exclusive to humans only. Thus, from that, we were able to conclude it's human blood. It's a positive result or evidence that indicates the presence of human blood specific. Further studies as well by Dr. Kurse, for example. Some of his articles are going to be provided in the recommended that mention some of the various forensic as well as serological testing that proves the presence of human blood on the Shroud. So yeah, it's undeniable, Shroud skeptic. It is real blood, whether you like it or not. So yeah, that's something you'll have to deal with. Okay, so again, what are RFs though associated with the bloodstains? Because we're not assuming it is real blood for our purposes. And I'm going to try to list these off quickly because I see we're already above an hour here. So in the first place, we know that the blood clots were transposed to the linen during what's called fibrinolysis. So that's a process where the clots are liquefied. So they're sufficiently liquefied or in a liquid state so that they transfer to the clot, as a serous-laden liquid, or possibly as a moist jelly-like, semi-coagulated state. Dried bloodstains don't transfer to cloth, so that we know that they were not dried. They were watery in nature. They were wet, or at least semi-wet or semi-coagulated. Also, all the bloodstains transferred completely. There are no interruptions or discontinuities with them. They appear in the exact size, shape, and appearance as they would had they flowed and congealed on human skin. That's how the experts put it. Also, the bloodstains have saturated to the point that they've become embedded into the cloth. So remember, the body images are superficial. Well, the bloodstains are the exact opposite. They soak right through and show up on the backside of the cloth, albeit a little bit fainter, but in the same size and shape as they correspond on the inner side. Bloodstains show, obviously, as a liquid, they show evidence of cementation or capillary flow, unlike the body imaging. The bloodstains also have darker perimeters versus a faint center. So the outside rim of the bloodstains are darker in color. They're darker red than the centers of the blood. This is a sort of a new aspect, and it hasn't been as rigorously confirmed yet. I'm still gonna mention this as an MRF, but I'll be sort of iffy about using it against natural hypotheses as much. But I'm still going to mention it because it is a fact of some bloodstains, but it hasn't been an aspect that Stirp has rigorously tested and confirmed for yet, but it does seem to be scientifically verified. So also the bloodstains are photographic positive images, unlike the body images, and they have a different mineral composition to some of the suggested paints that have been suggested by Macroni, as we'll see, for component the bloodstains. There are also various off-image as well as on-image bloodstains. So not all of the bloodstains correspond to stains on the Shroud Man. There are images that we know are off-image. That's kind of weird for a medieval artist to paint. Why would he do that? There's no context as to where they came from, but scientists Stirp scientists have been able to prove that while these off-image bloodstains fit exactly the expected configuration of a body-shaped object being wrapped in a shroud, the shroud image being flattened out, and then the shroud being flattened or straightened out, making it appear that these bloodstains are just off image. They have no context it being part of a body. As I said with the scourge wounds, same with the blood marks, UV fluorescence spectral testing has proven that the bloodstains have at least what appear to be serum retraction rings, or halos if you want an MRF, which are associated with them and which are invisible to the naked eye. Next, here's an important one. There are no encoded body images underneath the bloodstain. So here's a quote from the experts. Experiments were performed employing various enzymatic removal of the blood from blood-coated fiber samples. We're going to get more details on that in part Criterion B on the painting hypothesis. But these experiments revealed that there is no image body beneath the blood or the blood serum at the boundary of the tested bloodstains. The image color was found to precisely terminate consistently at the boundary of the bloodstains and or serum retraction ring. Now that's impossible for a medieval artist. We'll talk about that later, but there's no overlap, as we'll find out. The body images terminate precisely where the bloodstains are. So this implies that the bloodstains got encoded onto the shroud first, and somehow whatever mechanism created the body images, it was interfered with or hindered by the presence of the bloodstains, resulting in no body images being formed in those locations. Also note that there is no evidence of any major smearing, denaturing by heat or charring, thermal degradation, or there's no damage, and or otherwise there's no alteration to the bloodstains or to their associated invisible serum retraction rings or halos. They're in pristine condition. There's also various blood non-contact zones. There's some bloodstains that are encoded on the shroud but would not likely have been in contact, at least with a naturally draped cloth, unless someone wants to postulate some sort of external pressure being applied, or somehow the cloth was forced to conform artificially to the body so that these areas would be touching. But again, that would cause some issues with the nature. The bloodstains are in the exact shape, right? If you put a bandage on a bloody wound, it creates a big smeared blob. So those two items could conflict at some point. But just to give an example of some of these non-contact zones. So for example, there are about 20 different blood marks that have been identified across the back of the man's head. Well, a round surface means that not all of these points would make contact with a hard limestone floor or a cloth that's spread upon it. Also, the shoulder blades, the top parts of the shoulders, as well as much of the lower back, right? If you lie down, the small of your back will be curved up. It won't be touching or flat on the surface. Therefore, there will be a gap between the shroud lying underneath and the small of your back. But yet, we have blood stains and scourge wounds from those areas encoded somehow onto the shroud. So yeah, there are various locations based on the position of the Shroud Man that we know would be unlikely to have been in contact, and therefore this creates some problems for how these bloodstains and scourge wounds would have been encoded onto the shroud in pristine condition. Okay, so just a couple extra bloodstain features. Again, these ones are not MRFs, but I'm trying to be as thorough as I can and mentioning as much as I can, just so when you encounter it, you're aware of it. So there's also the fact that most shroud experts, as I said, believe that the blood was deposited first onto the shroud, and then the body images were created, and the blood interfered with that process. That's not an MRF, that part, though. It might be possible to say that the blood somehow got on afterwards, although it appears really strained. But yeah, so recognize that I think it's true, and that most shroud experts make the obvious conclusion, let's say, that the blood was on the shroud first, and then whatever caused the body images to form, the blood stains interfered with that process and prevented body images from forming underneath them or from forming in those locations. Now, one last thing, and this is an interesting one. I'm going to provide an article here. This is not an MRF, but some of the blood marks in the forearm region, for example, have been mysteriously encoded in exactly the same way as the body images. So it's almost like some of the blood stains as body images. So, they're composed of degraded cellulose, or, the same way the body images are. And that's an interesting finding that John Jackson argues for in his article, where he analyzes 4 possible theories that can potentially account for them. And here's what he says. So he says, quote unquote, it seems that blood clots generated images of themselves in some cases, just as the skin and hair did, where the cloth/clot contact was very doubtful. So that's an interesting one. I'm going to provide that article for you to decide for yourself. I won't be including that as an MRF. That's a weird thing that Shroud researchers have discovered that you can read about and decide for yourself. So all in all, I think that after everything with the bloodstains and all the anatomical aspects that we've studied is said and done, the notion that medieval artist created all of these features, including ones that are impossible. I don't use that word lightly, but I'm going to quote Pierre Barbet, again, the chief autopsy surgeon and professor of anatomy at St. Joseph's Hospital in Paris, France. When he was asked about the possibility of a medieval forger creating the Shroud Man's images, he said, quote unquote, never would he have succeeded in producing these stains with clearly marked edges, which with such outstanding truthfulness reproduce the shape of the clots as they were formed naturally on the skin. I'm sorry, the Shroud skeptic is just wrong. It's impossible. I think that there's a 0% chance that some medieval artist created all of the various features of the blood and anatomical aspects that we have with the Shroud. 0%. I'm quite firm on that. There's nothing a Shroud skeptic can say in response to that. Okay, so just before, again, moving on, there are some counter features about the bloodstains which I have to address, and there's a total of 3. So the first one we're not going to address. As I said, I'm saving that for discussion on the painting hypothesis in Criterion B, but these are the various pro-paint observations that Walter Macrones was involved with Stirp, said he was able to scientifically prove, and he does present evidence that has to be admitted, that support the conclusion that the bloodstains are composed of paint as opposed to real blood. That needs to be tackled, but we're going to delay that. So a second one is, well, the bloodstains are red. There's this enduring redness. Actually, they're not red. They're more a deep red or a carmine color. But still, no. If it was real blood, it should be brown or black. If it's centuries old, even if it's medieval, it should be black by now. It shouldn't still be this red color, right? And believe it or not, this was actually the one counter feature that prevented my friend and the Shroud expert Barry Schwartz from believing the Shroud was authentic. It took him 17 years until the mid-1990s before he realized that actually, no, the Shroud is authentic, and this was the sole factor that was preventing him from concluding this. So how can pro-Shroud people respond to the fact that the Shroud is red? Bloodstains are red. This is an undeniable fact. It can't be dismissed. Well, firstly, supernatural theories involving radiation, like Mark Antianici's neutron or proton flux. This perfectly explains why the bloodstains are still red. Obviously, this is a supernatural explanation, so that this wasn't what convinced Barry Schwartz. He doesn't believe the Shroud's images are formed by radiation or supernatural. We have a perfectly normal, natural explanation. This was proven by the, again, Jewish blood expert, Dr. Alan Adler. And he basically said that, well, it's obvious that this Shroud Man had been tortured. He wasn't given any water for an extended period of time, and we can assume he would have been in what's called hypovolemic shock. So if that were the case, then this means that the liver would begin to manufacture a chemical known as bilirubin, and that bilirubin is then released into the bloodstream. Well, with this chemical known as bilirubin, this is a hemolytic agent, and it basically breaks down the walls of the red blood cells in your blood, and that obviously releases what's called hemoglobin. So with that will allow blood to stay red forever. Bada boom, bada bing. We've got our explanation as to why the Shroud images are red. Sorry, Shroud skeptics, you've failed again in your attempts to show that this is an artistic fake. But yeah, this is the fact that the Shroud's bloodstains are red is an obvious fact. It's an undeniable potential counter feature that's irrelevant because it can be explained. It doesn't prove there wasn't a body. Now here's one I'm excited to present because it's one I didn't know about until one of the listeners here, Darren Lute, provided a link. It's basically there's a new scientific test based on blood pattern analysis, or BPA, tests which are alleged to have proven the Shroud's bloodstains are unrealistic. Or sorry, at least some of the bloodstains on the Shroud are unrealistic. And as I said, this is relatively new, so I'm providing links to both the news article that the listener provided in the comments section, as well as the scholarly journal, peer-reviewed journal article from the Journal of Forensic Sciences. So this is good. This is scientific experimental evidence that can't just be dismissed, whether you like it or not. And I've also provided sources countering that from a pro-Shroud proponent, Mark Antonici, addressing this new study and the problems with it. So, but yeah, I just wanted to mention this is a new counter feature that needs to be brought up. And he basically did 2 different experiments showing that the bloodstain flowing down the arms were unrealistic given a crucifixion position or a vertical position. And also the chest wound is unrealistic because it should flow down in streams. It wouldn't pool up like a fully filled bloodstain like what we have with the Shroud. Luigi Garlashelli, scientists, conducted a series of various tests through this blood pattern analysis on a mannequin and through the forearm of a volunteer. They discovered that there are various blood rivulets that don't line up with the theory that the arms are nailed at a 45-degree angle. They assumed that this 45-degree angle is there, and also from the chest wound, they conclude that it wouldn't be able to show up as a pool. And also there's this blood belt across the lower part of the Shroud Man's back. And they say based on their experiments, well, that wouldn't happen. The blood wouldn't go and curve around and create this sort of belt around the man's back. Okay, so in terms of what we can say, so first of all, looking at the hand and arm blood flows, the first thing to point out here is that they use a heavy anticoagulant for the blood. So it makes the blood unrealistically watery. It's more like colored water than actually blood. This means that the blood in real life of Jesus or of the Shroud Man would have flowed much slower and their experiments are not realistic to how real blood would have flowed. Now, one thing just to admit here, because Mark Antonici, the source I was using for the counter, he doesn't mention this, so I'm going to throw this in, is that Alan Adler and some STURP scientists do admit that because of the severe torture of the man beforehand and all of the previous bleeding prior to the crucifixion and the spear wound, it is possible that some of the blood's clotting factors could have been depleted by this torture. So, this anticoagulant isn't totally off base, but it's the extent to which these scientists do it. I mean, no matter what would have happened, no matter how depleted the blood of the Shroud Man's clotting factors would have been, it would not have been as watery, basically like colored water, red colored water is what these people were using in this experiment. So that's totally off base. You're not allowed to use that as a valid comparison to prove that, well, the results we got on this mannequin from these blood flows using colored water basically is not comparable to the Shroud, therefore the Shroud can't be real blood flows. That's a mistaken reasoning there. One thing to mention, when the crucifixion victim was suspended from a cross, some, Pierre Barbet, some experts say that, well, he couldn't breathe and he would lift up in order to breathe, raising his arms on a horizontal axis, altering by about 10 degrees or so whenever he would breathe in and out. And this could account for some of the reason why the blood flows are in differing directions. Plus, I mean, this guy, when he's taken down from the cross, he's going to be in all sorts of different directions and carried to the tomb. Now, one thing just to counter about the anticoagulant, bear in mind, also, the fact that the victim would have been dehydrated could also be said to slow down the blood flow because it would be more viscous. There would be, plus the dirt or sweat, any swellings on the body. These would all be factors which would inhibit or slow down the blood flow, which wouldn't make these scientific experiments realistic to how blood flows would flow on the Shroud Man in real life, someone actually being crucified. Another point is these Garlashelli and his And the scientists in this article also mentioned that there's a gap in the Shroud Man's blood flow and on his left forearm. But this is obvious where this came from. It's because while the man was in rigor mortis, they had to grab the arm. That's a perfect location for them to grab it, wiping off the blood, and lower it into, covering his groin area. So this has a ready explanation. This is not problematic at all. This so-called gap in the lower forearm of the man on the shroud. So yeah, in terms of the arm and hand wound and the blood flow associated with that, the author's artificial experiments are very unrealistic. They don't apply to an actual real human crucifixion victim, so they're not applicable. You're not allowed to logically use their results and say, well, this is impossible in real life. They don't take into account many of the features that would have been more comparable to what we see with the Shroud Man, and consistent with what all the forensic experts who studied the shroud directly in terms of stirp scientists and that sort of thing on the actual cloth. Remember, I've got a list of 24. Mine are better than yours if you want to play a numbers game or, who's got the most authorities. Yeah, like I said, we don't need to do that. It's based on the evidence itself, and the evidence is we know that these experiments were not realistic. Therefore, they can't be used as a comparison. Now, in the second set of experiments, this is where we look at the chest wound, and they use synthetic blood on a small sponge, which was soaked with it, and then they put this sponge on a stick, lay a mannequin horizontally out, and then sort of stab the mannequin sideways, horizontally. Well, in the first place, this is a problem, because then when they do that, they get three little lines. It doesn't pool up like what we see with the Shroud Man. Therefore, they're like, well, the chest wound is totally unrealistic. We've proven it. Well, no, you haven't. In the first place, it's not realistic because Jesus was up on a cross. This guy was up on a cross, presumably, and would have had an upward spear thrust into him. The spear wasn't thrust into him horizontally. Once again, we have the problem of anticoagulant. This was runny water, colored water, really. Not comparable to what we'd have with the Shroud Man. Also, they totally forget about the fact that there is a clear watery fluid present on the shroud. This is the serum. It wasn't just blood, but it was also the serum from the pleural cavity in the chest that we have proven scientifically is present on the shroud. This clear fluid, which is invisible to the naked eye, also on there. So if Jesus was on the cross, both the blood and the watery fluid would have oozed out from the side wound by gravity. And this would have come out in one flow. There's only one hole, right? So when it escapes the right man's auricle, when that's stabbed or pierced, that would have come out through the one hole. It couldn't have gone off or splayed out in those three directions that these scientists claim is the real way a wound would go. Also, stirp scientists have proven that it is possible for a blood belt. This is a scientific experiment, and they've proven it, that by pouring water, that it could curve around the back, the lower part of a man's back, all the way around, and including the results in this scientific test by these skeptics also proves it, because with their mannequin, in one of the experiments, it did actually curve down around the lower back, but part of the lower back of the mannequin was touching the thing, so it stops in the middle and pools in the middle. It doesn't go all the way around the lower back like a belt on the Shroud Man. But that wouldn't be a problem in real life with a real human being, because if you lie down flat on your back, the lower of your back is curved up. It's not touching a flat surface like your middle back is, so any blood that curves around there is going to go all the way around. It's not going to stop in the middle because it's not going to be inhibited by your lower back touching the surface. It's curved up. It's not touching anything. So there's nothing to hinder the blood from going all the way around if we're talking about a real body versus this mannequin that they're using. And as to the various angles, as I said, just think about all the various positions the man in the shroud was in, taken down from the cross, sort of awkwardly trying to take him down from the cross, transporting him down to the tomb, then wrapping him up and doing a burial wash. I mean, there's so many different ways that this blood belt could have formed, or that the different angles of the blood flows could appear in a way that's not consistent with a horizontal supine position. So yeah, these experiments are just utterly meaningless. They don't prove what want to say, because they use inappropriate methods and they make erroneous comparisons between their blood flows on the shroud and then use that to judge the shroud. This is an error in logic. They try to say that these experimental results disavow and prove the shroud's flows are unrealistic. This is just not true. I admit it's a good, they did scientific experiments. It's not something to just dismiss and ignore, and that's why I'm going to be providing the sources pro and con for you guys. But like I said, in light of these problems, I'm not troubled. I'm sticking with the actual forensic experts and pathologists who say, over 24 of them over the past century, 20th century and beyond, who've all agreed, no, the Shroud Man is anatomically flawless. He is anatomically accurate by and large with all these various features. So yeah, so I think just quickly now, we're going to get into the next minimal relevant feature, and these are the additional features. And just for time's sake, because I can see, oh goodness, we're at an hour and a half. So I'm just going to more or less list these off for you guys. Sorry, I know I'm doing a lot of rushing to fit in everything here, but okay, so the first additional feature is that the images are two-dimensional directionless. There's no brush strokes. Everyone admits this. Walter Macroni, who believed in the painting hypothesis, admits this is a fact. But it was discovered in 1976 by two scientists, Don Lin and John Laurie. These are image processing specialists at NASA. They worked at NASA. So, not pseudoscientific nutters, as people like Alan and skeptics like to falsely claim. But they used space-age technology called a microdensometer to study the photographic negative images, and they discovered that there was no, very shockingly, because at that time they thought it was just, it was comparable to a painting and stuff like that, but the color of the body images have a complete lack of two-dimensional directionality. There's no length or width dimensions to the shroud's body images. The next feature is that the non-image area of the shroud fluoresces under ultraviolet illumination, but the body images do not fluoresce. And this is going to be relevant to scorch-type hypotheses because it indicates that the shroud was formed with a low-temperature mechanism, not in a non-thermal range. High-temperature thing, there are scorch marks from fires on the shroud, and they do fluoresce red under ultraviolet, but the shroud's body images do not fluoresce red in this way. Next up, various photomicrographs and samples show that the body image's color is a result of concentrations of yellow to light brown fibers. So that's the color of the body images. Most believe this is because it's degraded or oxidized cellulose, such as through radiation or scorch hypothesis. But we're not going to assume that. It could be a result of some sort of staining for this color as well. What this feature is that we can conclusively prove that both the body images and the bloodstains are not composed of any paints, pigments, or binding mediums of any historically documented artistic substances up to and including the medieval period. More detail on that, because there's a heck of a lot involved in that, so I'll be proving that in a later podcast. Next up, there's no evidence of layering. The body images and the bloodstains, there's no overlapping color. Like if you draw a line on the thing and then you draw over top of that line. As I said, also the body images terminate precisely at the bloodstain and serum retraction rings. There's no overlap or damage to those bloodstains or invisible serum retraction rings. Somehow, miraculously, this artist that skeptics like to claim created it terminated his images precisely at the boundary of an invisible image of serum retraction ring, what look like serum retraction rings or halos around these bloodstains. Also, there are no observed microscopic, chemical, or spectroscopic evidence for the presence of dry powder at all. This includes even in the crevices of the threads. Big problem for some shroud skeptical theories coming up. Next up, the sixth additional feature is microchemical evaluation has indicated no evidence of any spices, oils, nor any other biochemical or organic substances which are known to be either produced by a dead body or associated with a human body in life or death, so that there's no alloys or myrrh or embalming oils and fluids that have been proven on the interior, on the cloth. So that's sort of related to that. There's no signs of decomposition. Those facts all go hand in hand. Now, just before getting to our last additional feature, there is a counter feature to mention here that's going to be relevant for one specific theory coming up. It's one of the better ones, but STIRP chemist and scientist Ray Rogers has his Maillard reaction theory, and this involves sugar or starch. What's been found is microchemical tests with iodine and pyrolysis or mass spectrometry have detected the presence of various starch impurities on the surface of linen fibers from the Turin shroud. So, starch is a critical component of Rogers' theory, so this will be something that will support or could be used to support what his naturalistic theory that any pro-shroud guy needs to account for. Also, finally, the final additional feature, the seventh one, is that there are no detectable traces of photos or light-sensitive substances related to silver salts or silver nitrate or various light-sensitive emulsions. And there's no chemical or spectroscopic evidence of any of the silver species found on the shroud in relation to the shroud images. So that's going to be an important one for certain artistic theories coming up as well. Okay, so thank goodness this will be it for today, part 5. I know this has been a rather long episode, but in closing for next time, just be aware we're going to do the first part of the part 6 podcast on just doing a listener feedback thing. David asked me to do this for you guys and said you guys might appreciate it. And I'm also going to devote some time to progressing our argument just by providing a brief introduction to Criterion B, what my methodology is, so that for part 7, I can go straight into it and tackle our first image forming mechanism, the painting hypothesis as advanced by Walter Macrone. So that's the plan for next time. Thank you for listening and have a great day. Bye-bye. And just before you guys go, after listening to this when I was editing it, there was one quick thing I wanted to clarify. With regards to the two-dimensional directionality, I can picture people getting confused with what I meant by that. Obviously, the shroud images have 2 dimensions. You can see them, right? But so let's just put it this way. There are no detectable brush strokes. Like using a paintbrush, you can detect directionality on length and width directionality of the paint if you're doing it diagonally, horizontally, or up and down when you're using a paintbrush to paint something. So that's what I meant by the two-directionality thing. Okay, guys. This time, have a good day. Bye-bye.